Hey, what's up? In this video, we're going to cover nursing professional liability insurance. We're going to talk about negligence. We're going to talk about malpractice. How much does an attorney cost? And a whole host of other questions we're going to explore. And at the very end of this video, I'm going to share with you some gold nuggets I learned after listening to a 40-minute podcast on nursing professional liability insurance. So what is professional liability insurance? Professional liability insurance is the same thing as malpractice insurance. Professional liability helps protect you from claims that allege an error committed in the performance of your professional services resulted in some form of dangers or harm. While malpractice claims typically involve a physical injury, they can include violating a patient's rights, verbal abuse, or unprofessional conduct. So with professional liability insurance, essentially if you make any sort of error while you're working as a nurse, heck, even as you're working as a volunteer as a nurse or whatever, your nursing insurance covers you. It covers any sort of out-of-pocket expense you might have to pay for an attorney. It covers damages, things like that. So say you make an error, you get sued by a patient, and you owe that patient $50,000 for damages. Your professional liability insurance covers that amount. So to have a better understanding of what exactly professional liability insurance covers you against, it's good to know what malpractice is and what negligence are. This is what negligence is. If a person fails to take reasonable precautions that any prudent person would take, and their actions cause someone else harm, their actions could be considered negligent. Examples of negligence include a driver who runs a stop sign causing an injury crash, a store owner who fails to put a caution wet floor sign after mopping up a spill, a property owner who fails to replace rotten steps on wooden porch that collapses and injures visiting guests. So again, negligence is really just how a reasonable person would act in a specific situation. Of course, who defines what reasonable is? Presumably that's the courts or a jury. So if that's negligence, then what is malpractice? Medical malpractice occurs when a hospital, doctor, or other healthcare professional through a negligent act or omission causes an injury to a patient. The negligence might be the result of error in diagnosis, treatment, aftercare, or health management. So really, malpractice is acting negligent as a nurse. So if you're a nurse and you don't do something that a reasonable nurse would do in that same situation, you could be found practicing malpractice, or you might have some sort of malpractice suit against you. Here are some examples of medical malpractice: poor follow-up or aftercare, premature discharge, I feel like that sometimes happens to me, disregarding or not taking appropriate patient history, failure to order proper testing, failure to recognize symptoms. So we know what malpractice is, we know what negligence is. How often are nurses sued for malpractice? So here's an article I found with some interesting statistics on medical malpractice. Nurses account for approximately 2% of all medical malpractice payments, according to the National Practitioner Data Bank. Medical malpractice payments on behalf of nurses nearly doubled from 307 in 1997 to 586 in 2005. About 2/3 of these were against non-advanced practice registered nurses, that's most likely like you and I, with the remaining against nurse anesthetists, nurse midwives, and nurse practitioners. Nurses employed on medical surgical units had the highest percentage of involvement in litigation, 32%, followed by nurses employed on obstetrics units, 16%. The areas within acute care facilities in which nurses had the least involvement in litigation include coronary care units, intensive care units, operating rooms, pediatrics. It's kind of surprising. You would think that actually coronary units and ICU would have more litigation, but apparently not. So here's some interesting data from the Nurses Services Organization. They're an insurance company that covers nurses. This is for 2006, so it's a bit dated, so maybe these numbers have, who knows, increased, and perhaps they've increased proportionally to one another. So total number of claims in 2006 was 5,718. 50% of those claims were just claims, nothing happened, no action, that was it. There was a reprimand in 10 of them, probation in 12, suspension 6, fine with continuing education required, and revocation of license, 2 of them. Out of the 5,718 claims, only 1,500 of them were paid claims. So that's about, in my head, I think that's roughly about 20% or so. So to put these numbers kind of in a greater perspective, if we look here at this came from December 15, 2006 from Massachusetts Nurses Association. The total number of registered nurses in the United States was 2.7 million. So when we think about the number of claims, like what was it, close to 6,000 claims, and there's 2.7 million nurses, I mean, that's a very, very, very small fraction. So that alone might dissuade a lot of people from getting nurses insurance. It's like, well, what's the probability that I get sued or that I have to pay out? At the same time, that's kind of what insurance is for, right? That very, 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 very small chance that something bad could happen. And as we'll cover here shortly. When we see how much nursing insurance really costs, it's really not that expensive. So I almost feel like it's kind of worth it, but we'll get into that a little later. So if we take those 5,700 claims and we look at them, what exactly were nurses being sued for? Here are the most common employer complaints against nurses: unprofessional conduct, 63%, misconduct, 14%, drug-related, 9%, sexual misconduct, 3%, fraud, 2%, and other, 9%. All right, so we happen to be one of those unlucky people that's in that 5,700 number, right? We get sued, we have to find an attorney. Let's talk about how long it takes for an attorney to defend us. In other words, how much of their time are they going to spend defending us? Why do we care? Because attorneys charge by the hour. So if we look here, this TANA, non-TANA, this is like, TANA stands for something like the American Association of Nurses Attorneys. Basically, it's attorneys who specifically defend nurses. Then you have over here non-TANA. So these are attorneys who don't ordinarily represent nurses. We can look through the statistics here. Average hours to defend from 2002 to 2006. You can see there's generally an increase of the amount of time that nurses are having to spend, that attorneys are having to spend defending us. Why is that bad? Because they charge by the hour. So look, these statistics are dated. This is from 2006. I bet now these numbers might have even doubled. So maybe we're looking at around 60 to 80 hours to defend the average claim against a nurse. And factoring in that the average attorney costs between $250 to $500 an hour, bro, that's a lot of money. That's more money than I'm willing to pay. Let's just put it that way. So according to this insurance agency, here are average out-of-pocket legal fees. If you get an attorney who specializes with nursing or working with nurses, in 2006, it was about $3,600. Non-nursing attorneys was close to $4,000. 2006, what was that, like 15, 16, 17-ish years ago or so? So I bet these numbers are crazy. They're probably doubled. Presumably they've doubled. And this is just your legal fees. Like, this is how much it's going to cost you to find the attorney so that hopefully you don't have to pay some sort of damages. These are just legal fees. These don't include damages. It's a lot of money. In fact, on the podcast I listened to, the nursing attorney said that it's going to cost anywhere from about $250 to $500 an hour for an attorney. So you do the math. If it's like 60 to 90 hours that they're having to spend, I can't do the math in my head. I just know that's a lot of money. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, I get sued. I got to find an attorney. I'm looking at maybe between $10,000 to $20,000 in attorney fees. How much does the actual damage that I did to the patient cost on average? According to the most recent liability claim report from a nursing insurance liability company, the average nurse's malpractice claim costs $164,586. Sweet mother of God. Can you imagine having to pay that plus the legal fees? Plus, like, what if you lost your license after that? How would you even afford that shit? So at this point, we know, malpractice claims are infinitesimally small. They are very, very rare. But if you get hit with one of them, you're one of those unlucky ones. Maybe you just make an honest mistake on the job. It could end up costing you thousands upon thousands of dollars. Plus, you could even lose your license. Hey, we're cruising through this video. Hope you're finding something valuable in it. If you're really enjoying this video, please like it and subscribe. Thank you so much. At this point, I feel like we need to cover what exactly professional liability insurance covers. So your professional liability insurance covers the cost to hire an attorney for a deposition. So you might be called in for a deposition. That's where you give an official statement about a particular case. You're not in the court system necessarily, but you would meet somewhere and you're going to be asked questions that later will be that testimony, the statements that you're giving will be used later in the court proceedings potentially. So it covers the deposition, it covers the defendant expenses like lodging and travel, and fines associated with HIPAA privacy violations. The most commonly used coverage extension is license protection. Though nurses typically buy professional liability insurance for malpractice coverage, there are 36 times more licensing complaints filed against nurses with state boards of nursing than there are malpractice claims every year. So here's the cool thing I think about professional liability insurance. Not only does it cover malpractice, like when you just make an error and some patient is damaged by it, now you owe thousands of dollars, but it also covers anyone who tries to report you to the board. It covers attorney's fees to help represent you, because the reality is you don't want to go up against the board of nursing, the state board of nursing, and have to speak with them directly. You want an attorney to represent you, and that is what liability insurance also covers. And remember, my friends, the state board of nursing is not there for you. It is there for the patients, to protect the patients against crap that you might do, against errors that you might make. So we've covered a ton of information, but do we really, really need nursing malpractice liability insurance. Here's an article I found that says, no, we do not need nursing insurance. And it's from Legal Issues and Risk Management. It's by Lisa Miller. She's an attorney. Someone asked, do I need to purchase malpractice insurance? The short answer is no. There is no need for malpractice insurance, as the hospital employer is obligated to defend the employee working within its scope of employment. However, this is an area where many experts disagree. On the pro side of the argument, many authors cite the availability of your own personal attorney, protection of personal assets, and protections from a later lawsuit by the employer against the nurse should he or she be found liable for negligence. So that's what some people are saying. They're saying, hey, look, you do need professional nursing liability insurance. She is on the opposite end. She's on the other side. She says on the con side, which is where the author places herself, there are a number of points. First, given the availability of an additional payout to the hospital's policy limits, a plaintiff will be obligated to attempt to recover monies from all policy holders, making the nurse individually a deep pocket above and beyond his or her link to the hospital's malpractice policy as an employee. So what she's really saying here is that if you're covered independently with malpractice insurance, not only will a potential plaintiff, probably a patient, and their attorney go after the hospital and potentially you. Now they're going to go after you too, because look, they're like, hey, this person has malpractice insurance. They have deep pockets. They might be able to pay out more money. So maybe this is what she's saying, is that maybe if you hadn't had that malpractice insurance, they wouldn't have focused on you so specifically, but now after finding out that you have that malpractice insurance, now you become an easy target. The second reason, she says, is the allure of having one's own private attorney may be specious, as the attorney provided may have limited, if any, experience in malpractice cases compared with the attorney for the defense of the hospital. I don't really find this entirely that convincing, because I feel like if I get professional liability insurance, I don't know if it's just a bad assumption on my part, but I feel like the insurance company would know what attorney I should work with and which attorneys have experience handling these kind of cases. So I'm sort of surprised that an attorney is making this statement, because it just seems a little outlandish. I don't know. What do you think? Leave me a comment. I just feel like if you go through an insurance organization, they're going to be like, look, here are some attorneys who specialize in this. We work with this stuff. This is our job. We work with people who get claims filed against them every day. We know who to look for and what kind of attorneys to find to represent you. Here's her third objection to having professional liability insurance. She says, and should the attorneys be unable to agree, so this would be your attorney from the malpractice insurance that you have and the hospital attorney. So should these attorneys be unable to agree with each other on a unified defense, a number of additional problems may arise. She doesn't really go into details about this, but I'm just like, well, I would think that the two of the attorneys could come together and come about a unified defense. But regardless, the hospital has their attorney that's representing the hospital, not you. I don't know about you. I don't trust hospitals, bro. I don't trust hospitals. I don't think they have my interest in regard whatsoever. So I know that if I have my own malpractice insurance and I have my own attorney, that attorney is working for me. They don't associate with the hospital. They have my best interest at heart. The hospital's attorney, I would believe, has the hospital's best interest at heart, which may not necessarily coincide with your interest. All right, and here's her last objection to having your own malpractice insurance. She says, finally, as to the protection of personal assets, the number of cases where a nurse's personal assets were actually an issue, either from the plaintiff or from a later lawsuit by the employer, is so rare that it can be described as infinitesimal. In conclusion, it is the author's opinion that there is no need for a staff nurse to purchase individual malpractice insurance as long as he or she is working within the scope of employment. All right, so what do you think? I mean, the reality is infinitesimal. Does infinitesimal mean that it never happens? I mean, what if you're just that one or two or three people and you're just that unlucky number that happens, that gets caught, whatever. I don't know. You end up paying a ton of money. Maybe they go after your house. It might be just so exceptionally rare that it almost never happens. But what if it's you? And given the fact that, and we never talked about this yet, but given the fact that professional liability insurance really only it probably costs like anywhere from $120 to maybe $200 a year. It seems like a very, very small monthly payment every month to make just to ensure that this doesn't have to be you. So I'm curious, after hearing this lawyer's perspective on why a nurse should not get malpractice insurance, are you convinced by her reasoning? Maybe you have more experience about some of the things she said. What are your thoughts? Leave me a comment below. So admittedly, when I was doing the research for this video, I found it very hard to find people who said, no, you don't need it. In fact, she was really the only one that said, no, you don't need it. Also keep in mind, though, that a lot of the people that said you do need nursing insurance had a sort of conflict of interest, in my humble opinion. So these might be people who run a nursing insurance company. They might be attorneys who are hired by the same company. So there's definitely a conflict of interest. So just bear that in mind as we go through some of this other research that we're going to be looking at. The next article I found that was for having nurses insurance, meaning that you should buy your own professional liability insurance, was this legal clinic. The title is called Malpractice Insurance and Licensure Protection. It's cheap and you need it. Again, this is written by an attorney who works with an insurance company that uses his services. So he clearly has a bias in being in favor of someone who's going to pay him for nursing insurance and representation and all of that. So this guy's an attorney. He says, the reason nurses give for being uninsured include the following. Nurses with malpractice insurance get sued more often than nurses without it. They can't get blood out of a rock. Even if I'm sued, I have no assets. It's a waste of money. Nurses don't get sued. Juries give higher awards when the provider is insured because they know the carrier picks up the tab. I don't practice in a high-risk specialty. My employer covers me. I work in a state or religious institution, so I have immunity. He then says many of these reasons for not having private insurance relate to malpractice litigation. However, you will also need legal representation if you are reported to the Board of Nursing, for example, by an employer, regulatory body, or criminal prosecutor, or could be a patient too, or if a complaint is made to the Board of Nursing. Such a report might come from a coworker or patient, or even because of press coverage. An employer's policy will only cover you for malpractice representation. Should you need to be represented before a state board of nursing, you will be on your own. So again, your hospital, wherever you're working, it doesn't cover anything that's against your license. You are completely on your own without an attorney. That's you who has to pay out-of-pocket attorney fees to hire someone to represent you in front of the state board. And if we remember, most reports against nurses are against their licensure, not for malpractice. So let's look at some common myths according to this article. Common misconception number 1, nurses with malpractice insurance get sued more often than nurses without it. Plaintiffs don't know who is insured until after a lawsuit has been filed. So if you get sued by somebody, they have no idea whether or not you have. At the time of the lawsuit, they have no idea whether or not you have malpractice insurance. Knowing that you have malpractice insurance, that information is shared during the discovery process. If a patient thinks you've harmed her or him through negligence, being uninsured will not protect you. If an attorney thinks he or she can convince a jury that you departed from the standards of practice and that departure caused the injury, the attorney will not avoid naming you in the lawsuit simply because you are uninsured. At the same time, patients who think you have harmed them are not likely to take into account whether or not you are insured when they decide to file a formal complaint with the licensing board. And the Board of Nursing will investigate all complaints regardless of your insurance status. So this is interesting. I almost feel like this is in direct response to that other article we read by that attorney who said, no, you don't need insurance and you're going to be a deeper pocket if you have insurance. This attorney is saying, look, it doesn't matter when the suit is filed against you. They don't know that you have insurance. It's not like they're targeting you. That you have insurance is found out later in the discovery process. And you're still going to need an attorney to represent you through this entire process. You're still going to need an attorney to represent you in front of the State Board of Nursing if someone's going after your license. And remember, something we haven't mentioned yet, if you don't have malpractice insurance and you're working in a hospital and the hospital believes that you did not follow the policies and procedures of the hospital, or you operated outside of your scope of practice, guess what? Them mofos ain't going to cover you. You are not covered by their attorney. All right, let's cover misconception number 2. They can't get blood out of a rock. Even if I'm sued, I have no assets. If there is a judgment against you, the effect will be more disabling than declaring bankruptcy. Unsatisfied judgments, monetary awards that the defendant cannot or does not pay in violation of a court order to do so can lead to wage garnishment, the inability to obtain loans or mortgages, and destroyed credit records. Additionally, whatever assets you do have can be seized, including your home, bank account, and other possessions. Such a judgment can even affect inheritance or future assets. So all I can think of is just, wow, if this is you, remember what that other attorney said? I mean, she said it's pretty much infinitesimal. Great. Maybe it's like 5, 10 nurses a year where something like this happens. But imagine if that's you. Imagine if you're that nurse and it just destroys your credit, takes away your ability to pay your mortgage, and maybe on top of that you lose your license. What are you going to do? How are you going to honestly, what are you going to do? Leave a comment about what you're going to do. Let's go to the third misconception. Misconception, it's a waste of money. Nurses don't get sued. Again, when they say waste of money, we're talking like $120 to maybe $200 a year for this kind of insurance. While it's true that institutions and physicians are more often the object of malpractice lawsuits than nurses, nurses also are named in lawsuits. In addition, nurses are reported to state licensing boards and need to be defended against allegations of professional misconduct. There are also many situations in which the nurse isn't individually named in the lawsuit, but is reported to the board by an employer when there is a bad patient outcome. So say there's a lawsuit against the hospital, you happen to work with this patient, there's a bad patient outcome, the employer just might be like, hey, we're not going to cover this guy, we're not going to represent him, there was a bad patient. It doesn't matter even if you didn't do anything wrong. I mean, you might even provided great patient care, you still could be dropped by your employer's attorney potentially. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Most insurance plans provide adequate coverage for a cost of less than $100 annually. I don't know when this was written, but when I've looked into it, it's maybe between $120 and $200 a year. The small premium is also a business expense, fully deductible when you file your taxes. In this way, coverage costs little or nothing. Time for misconception number 4. Juries give higher awards when the provider is insured because they know the carrier picks up the tab. Again, this is something that first attorney said in her article. This was one of her concerns, so now this attorney is going to address it. He says, juries are charged with determining the facts solely upon the evidence presented. Extraneous concerns such as insurance coverage are not taken into consideration, and juries are not allowed to have insurance information. Wow. I mean, after reading that, then yeah, why would they award them more money? The jury doesn't know that you're covered. So again, I kind of feel like the other points that other author, the other lawyer has made are kind of moot points. What do you guys think? So leave me a comment. We're like maybe halfway through this video, but tell me where you're at. Are you leaning more towards having insurance, or are you more convinced by what the other attorney said, like, we don't need it? Let me know. Misconception number 5. I don't practice in a high-risk specialty. Certain specialties such as obstetrics and emergency nursing are associated with higher liability risks. This kind of seems in contradiction to some of the other information we read. Just remember that like some of these articles might be published at a different date, so that might be why there's kind of conflicting statistics. I know obstetrics seems to always be kind of a high-risk field, but this emergency nursing and that other thing we read, it said it was like a lower risk field, but whatever. I would think ER nursing would be pretty high. I would think obstetrics, ICU, and ER would be kind of high. So then he says, but no nurse is immune. Even nurses not in current practice, for example, those who are on vacation, off duty, or retired, can be sued or reported to the State Board of Nursing. So again, you're getting this coverage that works outside the scope and coverage of your employer's malpractice coverage. Misconception number 6. My employer covers me. Your employer has a policy on you because your employer can be held responsible for your actions. As an employee of the facility, you are acting as an agent of your employer under the legal doctrine respondeat superior, Latin for let the master answer. Your employer may have vicarious liability for your negligence. The employer has a policy not to protect you, but to protect the institution. And this is what I was saying earlier. Your employer only carries insurance to cover themselves, not you. They don't care about you. I know you probably work your butt off for your employer. I feel the pain. The institution looks good if you look good, so it is in their best interest of your employer to defend you vigorously. I totally butchered the reading of that, but whatever. If there is a conflict of interest between the employer and employee, however, the defense attorney's responsibility is to the employer. If your hospital's hiring an attorney, that attorney doesn't care about you. They care about the hospital. Likewise, if you hire your own attorney, guess what? That attorney cares about you and not the hospital. He continues, keep in mind as well that your employer is only responsible for occurrences within the scope of your employment. Your employer's policy will not cover you for anything happening outside of work or for allegations of departure from the institution's policies and procedures. Just out of curiosity, how many of you nurses out there, leave me a comment, how many of you out there have actually read the policies and procedures of your hospital? When I worked at the state hospital, I would sometimes go through our policies and procedures. What I can tell you is that it's like a huge manual. There is no way you can remember every single detail in that policy and procedure. I know 100% that at a certain time, without intentionally doing it, I have somehow, some way contradicted, gone against what the employer's policy and procedure stated. So if that's the case and I potentially got sued, I might be completely ignorant of that policy and procedure. And I might be a good person. I might be acting on behalf of my patient's best interest, whatever, and still I may not be operating within the policy and procedure of the hospital. So he continues here. For example, when it comes to hospitals' policy and procedures, hospital policy may state that intubation should be performed only by anesthesiologists or nurse anesthetists, physicians, or respiratory therapists. If an RN intubates a patient in violation of such policy, the hospital will not be liable for any airway problems the patient might experience. All right, so I don't know much about intubation and all that, but let's pretend that, and I don't even know if this is a thing nurses do. I almost feel like nurses don't intubate, but let's just hypothetically say you've had a ton of experience with it, you've trained, you've done an exceptional job intubating, you go to some other hospital and you just kind of do it as a matter of fact and as a matter of habit, and all of a sudden you're like, oh crap, maybe this hospital doesn't allow it. Maybe you're a traveling nurse and you didn't know. Your employer's not going to cover you. You need that malpractice insurance. He then continues, most nurses who feel comfortable with their employer's policies have not actually seen the policy they believe protects them. Misconception number 7. Are we on 7 or is it 6? I think it's 7. All right. He says, the nurse says, I have immunity. That's the misconception. Reality is the governmental, religious, and charitable immunities have been eroded or abolished completely in most jurisdictions. It would be imprudent to bank your career on what is rapidly becoming an obsolete concept. Even if it were difficult for a claimant to bring a suit against your employer for this reason, it is still very easy to make a complaint for the licensing board. I don't really know what this immunity objection stands for, so maybe it makes sense to you, and hopefully you found this useful. Here's another article I found that was in favor of nurses having insurance. It was January 2012 was when it was published. It's written by, I think, a school nurse. And she mentioned that the number of malpractice payments made on behalf of registered nurses increased from 253 to 413, which is a 64% increase in 3 years. And more nurses are being named defendants in malpractice lawsuits according to the National Practitioner Data Bank. And here are some examples she gives for why you'd want to have your own attorney. Providing a lawyer who will defend you and your interest, defending the nurse with no limits for the defense cost, providing a lawyer to represent the insured during an administrative proceeding by the State Board of Nursing for possible disciplinary action against the nurse resulting from the alleged negligent act, occurrence-based coverage 24/7, 365 in any setting, including work, volunteering, or answering a neighbor's question, affordable rates beginning at $99 a year for new grads. This was back in 2012, I think, and no deductibles. Here's another article I found in favor of nurses having their own insurance. It's called Legally Speaking, Personal Liability Insurance Coverage. When it comes to the hospital covering you and being under the employer's insurance, this is what this attorney has to say. He says, whenever the nurse is sued for alleged acts of negligence which are contrary to established hospital or agency policies and procedures, the hospital or agency may, if it desires, assert that the employee was acting outside the scope of his or her authority when the act was committed. If such were found to be correct by the court, not only would the hospital or agency avoid liability, but its insurance policy would not afford coverage for the employee nurse. So this did answer, okay, who decides whether or not you are working within your scope of practice and within the employer's policies and procedures? It sounds like the court, the judge, does that. And again, this guy is saying, like, look, if you're found working outside of that scope of practice or the policies and procedures, again, you're not covered. He continues, even if the employer assumes responsibility for the nurse's acts and elects to provide insurance coverage for him or her, the nurse is left at the mercy of the employing agency or hospital and their attorneys to represent the nurse's best interest. So again, it's like, do you trust your hospital to find an attorney for you that's representing you? Probably not. I certainly don't. All right, so those are the main resources I found that were either for or against nursing malpractice insurance. Now I want to share with you some golden nuggets I got after listening to about a 40-minute podcast that was done by a nursing attorney. I'll put a link down below if you want to listen to the full podcast. I just listened to it on times 2 speed and just made notes, and I was like, okay, this is something that I haven't read anywhere else, and so these are the gems we're going to cover now. So my biggest takeaway after listening to this podcast was that as a nurse, you really have to look at your license as an asset. So let's do some math. We're going to make the math easy. We'll say, let's say you make $100,000 a year. That might be more than you're making as a nurse. It's more than I'm making, but it makes the math easy. So if you're making $100,000 a year, and the course of your career, say 20 years, that's $2 million, right? You're going to make, as a nurse, $2 million. And that's not a bad average if you consider inflation and stuff. Maybe like 20 years from now, nurses will be making way over $100,000. I don't know. But the reality is your nursing license is an asset. It's what allows you to practice as a nurse. And when you practice as a nurse, you're making money. Without that license, you cannot make a nurse's salary as a nurse, right? So you have to see your license as an asset. And that was the biggest takeaway I got from this, is that when you have malpractice insurance, it covers complaints against your license because you have an attorney who's going to help represent you for any sort of complaint against your license. And this podcast was recorded recently, and according to her, she said the basic policy is right around $200 a year. She also said that probably the most important kind of nurse to have malpractice insurance is the traveling nurse, because the reality is you're bumping around from so many different hospitals. You don't have time to read all their policies and procedures. It's better just to be covered universally than have to worry about that kind of stuff. Again, in her podcast, she reiterated the fact that if you operate outside that scope of practice, you're not covered by your employer's insurance. You also have to have coverage at the time the incident took place. So if you get coverage now, but say the incident was like 5 or 6 years ago, you probably aren't going to be uncovered by your insurance company. Although I think there's something called like tail coverage, which might coverage that, but then that would cost you an additional premium every year. She says when you finally do find an attorney and you're having to pay out of pocket, it's between $250 and $500 an hour. Can you imagine making those kind of rates, by the way? That's just freaking crazy. Plus you have like retainer fees. A retainer fee is like, hey, I'm going to pay this attorney $5,000 to guarantee they're going to continue to work with me and not just work with me for a while and then dump me by the wayside. Apparently, like, attorneys aren't like nurses. There's no such thing as just abandonment with attorneys. Like, wouldn't that be client abandonment? I don't know. Anyhow, they have retainer fees that are exceptionally expensive. How do we get retainer fees as nurses? Another thing she mentioned in this podcast is that supposedly employers are telling people not to get their own attorneys. So why would an employer tell a nurse not to have their own malpractice attorney? I don't really know. I have no idea. Maybe it's just like, well, hey, there's one less conflicting party if we do get sued. We don't have to deal with Mary Jo's own private attorney. I have no idea. If you guys have any idea, please leave me a comment. She also mentions that criminal charges can affect your licensure. So again, like stuff you do, like, I don't know, if you get some DUI, potentially that could affect your licensure. Again, you want to protect your licensure. It's an asset. She reiterated the fact too that you're more likely to have a complaint against your license than you are to be sued for malpractice. And in the podcast, she mentioned that roughly 750,000 out of 5 million nurses have their own professional liability insurance. So that's like a little less than 20%, which makes me wonder, like, what are the rest of you 80% doing out there? So again, you guys, the main takeaway is your license is a multi-million-dollar asset. You want to protect it. After just doing this video, I was going to kind of leave this open to people. Me personally, I just feel like malpractice is worth it. I think I have, and I want to say maybe I pay $120 a year for malpractice insurance, and I'm like, dude, that's nothing monthly, right? For what we make hourly, I mean, that's a no-brainer for me. But maybe you're not convinced. I'm just convinced after watching this video. What do you think? Did I convince you to get malpractice insurance? Are you going to get malpractice insurance? Leave me a comment below. I hope you liked this video. Hope you found it helpful, and stay tuned for my next video. Goodbye.